Trump is consistently reluctant to talk about Ukraine. And here, after about 10 seconds, he gave himself a detour into Biden, Afghanistan. I built up the US military, blah, blah, blah. He completely diluted the answer. He never even answered the question. I think, look, I really believe that this whole back and forth about the Ukraine deal, and especially the payback through the minerals deal and all that, I think it's trolling. I think that you see that Zelensky continuously is dodging the deal with the United States. They were supposed to sign it a few days ago, and then again, there was a last-minute problem, and they didn't sign it. They can't do it because Zelensky already signed over the bulk of it. I think that the most powerful one is, again, the globalist or the vested interests of the Western Empire, the globalists who want to keep the United States as the global policeman, as the enforcement arm of the empire at all cost. One thing that is very clear to me, and where I'm in no doubt, is that Trump absolutely wants to end this. We had explicit statements from the administration that they are embracing multipolar integrations, that they consider the post-World War II global order as being adverse to the United States, and that it is used against their enemy as a weapon against the United States. So it's clear that Trump wants to extricate the United States from all this. But the globalist forces are in control of the media, they're in control of the EU, of Great Britain. Russia already provides security for that. Vladimir Putin has explicitly said that they welcome the United States to join Russia in developing these resources and benefiting from them. So again, it's the choice between two deals. One of the deals is being offered by Russia, and they said it's not just Ukraine's resources. We have about $75 to $90 trillion of resources in Russia proper, which we welcome you to join us in developing. And in that case, American corporations are welcome to come in, and they don't have to go to war. They don't have to place troops and military bases and risk a global war. But for some reason, they're not doing it, and they're taking a much more risky, much more complicated route that could result in all kinds of trouble, essentially to save Benjamin Netanyahu's hide. That it's so surreal that it's really difficult to explain. I can venture two explanations, which are my own. I'm guessing, but they make more sense to me than what the administration appears to be doing now. One is that they're simply placating, appeasing the pressure from these pro-Israeli fanatical supporters. The other one would be that they're taking advantage of the situation to strike another blow against Europe by cutting off the Red Sea trade route, which is probably inflicting some limited pain, but it's consistent in the administration's treatment of the Europeans. For the rest, it makes barely any sense at all. So I found myself wondering, are these people completely stupid, or is there something that is affecting their calculus that we're not aware of, some variable that we're not quite aware of? I also suspect that there may be some level of coordination between the US administration and the Russians and the Chinese. And that's based on so many hours that Trump had Steve Witkoff sit down with President Putin in Russia. I believe that there are other backroom communications going on. Trump himself said that he speaks with Xi Jinping not once, but he said a lot. I speak to him a lot. I try to go, whereas what this gentleman was talking about is, again, the Western European deal, which is, I think, pretty much a British three-card Monte, which is offering the United States a bait in the form of some future paybacks that the United States would get, but the cost is providing security guarantee. And I think that for Trump, it's a clear choice. Politically, this is very difficult for them to sell, to just say one day, okay, we're dumping our European partners and we're going along with Russia, because we are on the back of 20 years of solid 24/7 demonization of Russia and Vladimir Putin. So people are all, the fact that he wants to back out of Ukraine, people are already screeching appeasement, and the Trump and his administration are now under very concerted attacks in the media, not just in Europe, but also in the United States. So it's for him to get from where he is to where he wants to go, it's going to be a lot of dodging bullets. On the one side, you have people who want to cut deals, avoid further warfare. And I think that Donald Trump is in that camp. And on the other side, you have these messianic fanatics who, for whatever their reasons are, we know something about this, want this war. And this war could plunge humanity into a nuclear Armageddon. I think that it's ongoing, but I think that ultimately they're going to have a very hard time getting this war, not only because Trump's political faction might prevail for the time being, but also because I believe that in the bowels of the Pentagon and in the US military, there's an awareness that they're not in a good position to fight a war against Iran. And I think that the result is that the US military itself is very reluctant to get enmeshed in something like this. Several months ago, when I forget which aircraft carrier group it was, I think it was Eisenhower, they were sent from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. And there, mysteriously, their oiler, their fuel supply vessel, ran aground. And so the whole group couldn't be deployed. And that is such a strange event that I have to ask myself, putting troops on the ground in Yemen, just remember how well they've done in Afghanistan against the Taliban, and Ansar Allah is far more powerful than the Taliban. So it would be extremely stupid, and I still have a hard time thinking that Trump administration as a collective are stupid. And even if they were, then there's a whole command and control structure at the Pentagon and among the US troops that has a clearer understanding what they would be getting themselves into. So, and still, even let's say a moderate, reasoned opinion that it's not a good thing to attack Iran at this time, provoked an absolutely hysterical reaction. I think that this is not just a mild political opposition that they're facing there. This seems to me like a fanatical faction in the US political class, which are very strongly backed by the mainstream media. And they are now contriving this whole narrative around Pete Hegseth and support for Israel and hostility towards Iran. And I think that the result is that Pete Hegseth now has to display toughness against Iran. But what you mentioned, the US Navy losing an aircraft, whether the Houthis downed it or whether it was really lost because it rolled off the aircraft carrier while it was making a turn, this is showing you that if the United States is having such a hard time with Houthis in Yemen, what could they expect if they provoke Iran into defending itself to the full of its capability? So I think that what we're experiencing now is, again, exactly because you have these hysterical fanatics who desperately want the United States to go to war against Iran, cost it what it may. And they don't think of it as going to war against Iran. They think it's going to be easy, that it's going to be just a matter of dropping bombs, and then there's going to be a regime change, and then they're going to bring the Shah, and everybody's going to live happily ever after. But that's very unlikely to happen. And I think that if I understand that, probably a lot of people in the administration understand that as well. So again, it's much better to cut a satisfactory deal. I think that the United States has wanted to maybe get in and participate in Iran's oil industry and build nuclear reactors for Iran, which are not the greatest deal for Iranians because U.S. nuclear technology is now uncompetitive. It costs about 5 times what the Chinese nuclear technology costs, but it's still a lot cheaper than going to war. The Iranians could agree to some of that, and they could shake hands, sign the paperwork, and everybody's happy. The problem is in the United States. It's a political problem at home. But it's not only just about the AI and the algorithms and the whole magic that happens when you ask a question and then up pops the answer. It's also about generating sufficient electricity and having the infrastructure to accommodate all that. And the Chinese approach is a state-directed approach. They put a lot of thought into it. They published their 5-year plans. What this gentleman was talking about basically presupposes the United States providing a security guarantee for the Zelensky regime or for another government that's aligned with the West, so that they could, with the American troops and American armaments, protect these deals, the ability of Western interests to plunder and pillage in Ukraine. But the downside risk of that is that the United States is taking on the risk of a nuclear war against Russia. At the same time, Trump, through Witkoff, is discussing other kinds of deals with the Russians. First of all, Russia already controls the bulk of the natural resource wealth of Ukraine, which is in Donbas before the war accounted for close to 80% of Ukraine's GDP. It's where most of the gas reserves and coal reserves. And I know that the Chinese and the Russian agenda is to completely overhaul security architecture in the region. And it seems to me that Israel is a real problem in that sense. But Israel might become a much bigger problem if it faces an external attack. So if it goes to a war against Iran, then you would get the whole Israeli society close ranks behind their leader, whoever, even if they hate him, Benjamin Netanyahu, right? And then it's all out war. And then you can't tell what the consequences might be, medium term and long term. Whereas if you restrain yourself, Israel succumbing to its own internal conflicts. And I think that ultimately this is weakening Israel more than external attacks. And now majority of Israelis think that there's going to be a civil war. One way to avert a civil war is to escalate an external one. So in trying to interpret what the Trump administration is doing, and I don't really base this on the rhetoric, because obviously the rhetoric is usually for the domestic audiences. I think that they're trying to be overtly supportive of Israel, but hand them enough rope to hang themselves with. And then at some point when Benjamin Netanyahu's government falls, which I think is only a matter of time, then perhaps an internal reform in Israel will be possible. And then the United States can take a much more meaningful role in this process. Going to war completely flat-footed on answer on some court case regarding the deportation of an immigrant. And the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against the administration. And then there's a video footage of his advisor, Steve Miller, in front of the journalist, in front of the rest of his advisors, saying exactly the opposite, that the court ruled 9-0 in the administration's favor. So that's what Donald Trump thought. I wonder what the situation is when it comes to Ukraine. Okay, there's Steve Witkoff, which is a person who obviously has Donald Trump's trust, so maybe there he's well informed. But when it comes to the Middle East, to Israel, to Iran, to Yemen, I think there's a good chance that he's being fed disinformation, distortions. And so he can't make a sensible decision on these things. Now, I think that is a problem, and the problem is resulting in Trump's administration losing credibility. That happened. That really did happen. And many people now regard them as loose cannons. And you see the media, they're perpetuating now always, it's an order goes out, and then all of the anchors, all of the journalists, all of these politicians like Chuck Schumer, and they have been starting talking that Donald Trump is fomenting chaos, that the administration is in a chaos, that they're creating chaos. And so the attack is, on the one hand, he's being sabotaged with bad information, and then the media jump on it. In the United States, it's mostly driven by private capital, which is not focused on 5-year plans or maybe 20-year, 30-year plans like the Chinese. They're focused on quarterly earnings reports. And you can create the best AI in the world, but if you're drawing too much power from the network and the government hasn't built up sufficient infrastructure and power generating capacity, and the private sector hasn't either, then what do? Do companies like Google and NVIDIA have to start building their own nuclear power plants? Because that's what's being talked about as well. At some point, it becomes a little bit inefficient. So I think that China has a certain advantage in this respect. And I think it's not lost on these companies. And so why is he in China? Maybe because at some point it'll make sense to put some of their, amplify it. And as a result, they're losing credibility in the eyes of not only the American people, but also as their partners and counterparts around the world. I would say, nevertheless, that the fact that Trump picked up the phone and spoke with Vladimir Putin, the fact that in follow-up with this, we got Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov addressed the American audiences directly for a 45-minute interview, are extremely important developments, which until Trump were next to impossible. Literally since Vladimir Putin came to power, it's been non-stop demonization and practically complete shattering of diplomatic relations between the two powers. I'm as disappointed about certain things that Trump has done as anybody. Bombing of Yemen, the fact that Gaza is being bombed again, that people there are being starved deliberately, collectively. This is almost unbearable. But I would wager that if Kamala Harris won the presidency and was in the White House today, that the US administration would probably resemble Starmer administration in the UK. That you would have people being arrested for wearing the wrong t-shirt or for singing Kung Fu Fighting or for praying silently on the street. So I think that we have to acknowledge that for all his flaws, Trump is trying to do certain things right. And one of them happens to be maybe the most consequential for peace in the world, and that is US relationship with Russia. I expect that it will be difficult, not because it should be difficult for Trump to find a deal with the Iranians that is mutually acceptable, even if the Iranians say, okay, we're going to suspend the uranium enrichment and we're going to allow inspections, and the Russians were going to do enrichment for us and ensure that it cannot be weaponized, and so on and so forth. But the conflict between India and Pakistan now depends on Russia as the peacemaker. To a lesser extent, China, because there's also potentially a strained relation between China and India as well. So China has to maybe not exert pressure, but the Russians have taken action to try to douse this flame. And then there's also SCO, which has a year or two ago explicitly adopted a series of documents that, among other things, foresee formation of mechanisms and troops and military capabilities to combat terrorism and separatism, explicitly named as such, which have been the tools of Western powers to foment instability and wars in the region. I can't imagine that he's not asking for the intelligence. That would be the most natural thing to do, to call his advisors and say what exactly is going on here. But it does seem that he's being sabotaged in this sense. And yesterday I watched a program on Jimmy Dore where he shows how Donald Trump was giving an interview to the American media and he got completely flat-footed. Russia might have good relationship with Germany once more after AfD takes over the government. When that's going to happen, I don't know. They might even ban AfD. They've been desperate to ban AfD for a long time. In France, maybe when Marine Le Pen comes to power, which, again, we don't know if that might happen and when. But I think that as the European Union is structured now, the power structure there is entrenched. It's not going to be dislodged democratically. This is impossible. The whole thing is structured so that it's immune to democratic will of the people. So that's not going to happen. I think what's going to happen instead is that you're going to have a disintegration of the European Union, probably NATO as well, and then individual nations